This is the first in a series of short films about the Huguenot contribution to culture in this great metropolis in the late 17th and first half of the 18th century. And I'd like to start by focusing on the print which the artist William Hogarth produced, entitled Noon, which shows the Huguenot congregation emerging from their chapel in Hog Lane in Soho in 1738. It's Sunday, it's midday, and in the background you can see the spire of St Giles in the Fields, a church which is still extant today, and the sober and beautifully turned out Huguenots contrast with other Londoners. And indeed, it was recommended by Lord Chesterfield that if you wanted to improve your French, you should go to Soho, where the venerable refugees were very friendly to strangers, and lodgings and legumes were very cheap, and that you would be made to feel much more welcome than if you went to Paris, where as an Englishman, you would probably be ignored. This is the first of a few discussions about the contributions that the Huguenots made to London in the late 17th century. And by way of introduction, behind me is a copy of John Roke's map of London and its surroundings. This particular map was published in the late 1760s, by when some 25,000 Huguenot refugees and their descendants had been absorbed into the greater population of London. Today, I want to speak about their contribution to watch and clockmaking. Huguenots are associated with silk weaving and silver, but their contribution to horology is perhaps the most significant, the most international, and the most long-lasting of those contributions. I want to start by looking at a very fine watch in the Museum of London collections, which bears the signature David Le Sturgeon. It's in a silver pear case with its original silver watch chain attached. David Le Sturgeon was the second generation of three successive clockmakers, each of them named David. The maker of this watch came to London in 1681 with his father. He had been born in Rouen. Some 17 years later, he joined the London Clockmakers Guild, which had actually been set up in the 1630s with financial backing from members of the then Huguenot community in London, a community that had been established in the mid-16th century by the Protestant boy king, Edward VI. So Le Sturgeon demonstrated his loyalty to the English crown by including on the back of the movement of this watch a little chased bust commemorating William III, who died on the 8th of March, 1702. There are a series of these commemorative watches, and other examples can be seen at the British Museum, normally on display, and the Metropolitan Museum. And you can see the Met's example, which celebrates Queen Anne online, even though obviously a trip to New York at the moment is not possible. But perhaps we can pick up something of the value of these watches by scouring the London daily papers during the lifetime of David Le Sturgeon II. And I quote now from London Daily Courant, 19th of July, 1709. Lost last Saturday night, the 16th of July, in or near St. James's Park, a silver pendulum watch, the maker David Lesturgeon, with a silver chain, the pendulum upon the dial plate with a queen's head upon the inside plate, underneath the inscription in Latin. The reign began on the 8th of March in 1702, the very date of William III's demise. Whoever brings to Mr. Lesturgeon, watchmaker in Lothbury, shall have 1 guinea reward without being asked any questions. So we know that David Lesturgeon II was working in the city of London, and in fact, he was buried at the Church of St. Bennet Fink, which was in Threadneedle Street, adjacent to the original Huguenot church, which had been destroyed during the Great Fire, but rebuilt and was still welcoming a Huguenot community in the year of David Lesturgeon's death in 1729. The next watch I'd like to focus on is signed by Simon de Charme. It's a gold pear case watch, which meant that you had to open out the outer case in order to wind the inner case and movement from the back. Simon de Charme was recorded in London by 1688. In 1691, he joined the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers, and another, probably brother, David de Charme, joined the guild in 1692. Simon de Charme's workshop and shop was established at the sign of the clock, appropriately, in Warwick Street, Charing Cross. He was extremely successful in clockmaking, which was a very profitable business, and was able, with his profits, to buy a large estate in Hammersmith, 25 acres, adjoining what is today Shepherd's Bush Road. It was known as originally Charme Hall and then became known as Grove Hall. He died in 1734, and his business in Charing Cross was carried on by his eldest son, Simon. And in 1736, the celebrated musician George Frederick Handel sent his niece's husband, who was a professor at the University of Halle, a gold watch by de Charme as an appropriate wedding present. So imagine you're a first-generation Huguenot refugee and you've made good as a successful clockmaker, and you're thinking about the occupation of your eldest son in the way that David Lesturgeon and Simon de Charme both did. You might turn to Robert Campbell's very useful guide to the different trades in London, published in 1747, The London Tradesman. And he would advise you that although the watchmaker's business is of modern invention, it is of late improved in England to the highest perfection. We beat all Europe in clocks and watches of all sorts, and export those useful engines to all the parts of the known world. Small wonder then that in the 1750s, another very talented clockmaker, watchmaker, came from the continent to settle in London. His name was James Tregent, or Tregent, and he probably came to London from Geneva, which had been a centre of Protestant watchmaking since the 16th century, when the Huguenot theologian John Calvin had settled in that city and encouraged the manufacture of watches because the product was both useful as well as beautiful. James Tregent set up business in the area of what is today Leicester Square. He joined the Clockmakers' Company in 1781, so 100 years after David Lesturgeon arrived in London. And Tregent was much admired as a maker and became watchmaker to the Prince of Wales, the future Prince Regent. And I was very excited this morning, looking to find out more about James Tregent, to be able to download his will from the National Archives and to discover that he lived in a courtly style, which was characteristic of a watchmaker who was working for the royal family. So in his will, he describes his 2 bookcases complete with printed books in his library, and the style in which he entertained. He had an extensive tea service, which was customized with his own initials and coat of arms. He had silver tea and coffee service, but his own sort of personal dress accessories, his gold buttons, his gold stock buckle, his gold-headed canes, and his dress swords indicate that when James Tregent went to court, he would have done so in style. So I'd like to leave you today with the idea of the sheer number of watchmakers of Huguenot origin who came from the different regions in France and Switzerland, who settled in London, and also the way in which some of them fed back their profits into sustaining members of their community. So it was David Hubert, another watchmaking family from Rouen, who founded the French Protestant school at Westminster, which we'll look at tomorrow. Thank you.